I thought watching the trailer for Novocaine, I understood what this movie was. It was supposed to be an over-the-top action movie where a guy cannot feel pain, so he can just do some of the most ridiculous crap possible to himself to inflict pain onto other people. And watching Novocaine, that is in part what this movie is, and I also think at times it doesn't really commit to that premise enough. And that's what I wanted to talk about in my review today. Is this movie too silly, or does it actually not meet the mark that it is setting up for itself? And let's just kind of start there, because there is a lot to like with Novocaine, and specifically I really just want to get this out of the way early. Jack Quaid is an actor from The Boys and even recently this year Companion. I really just like him as a screen presence. I really like this guy. I think he's super talented. I think he is a good leading man. He does everything that I want from him. I think he plays his type very well. And like I said, generally, whenever I see him in anything, I'm always happy to see him in stuff. That is the same feeling I had even watching Novocaine, where this movie, which is an hour and 50 minutes, which to be honest is too long for this movie, despite that, Jack Quaid is entertaining throughout it. Like, I am on board for this movie enough because I am a fan of Jack Quaid. And I think what the Jack Quaid character does in this movie / what Jack Quaid does as an actor works throughout his entire career and pays dividends in this movie. This is a very good leading man performance from Jack Quaid. And that's kind of where I want to stop, because I think now we need to get into some of the issues of this movie after praising Jack Quaid. And before I go any further, I just want to say, make sure to subscribe to this channel for more reviews. But back into my review of Novocaine. While thinking about this movie and watching it, I was kind of surprised with the premise that they took this movie in. Essentially, this character is somebody that cannot feel pain. And after a bank robbery gone wrong where they kidnap his kind-of-ish girlfriend, like, he ends up going on this adventure to basically save her as a guy that cannot experience pain. And he's not a superhero, but his inability to feel pain really does help him out and allows him to do some gnarly stuff to his body to fight bad guys. And that's a fun premise. The movie that it reminded me most of in scenes is the Crank films with Jason Statham. Like, when this movie is good, I think that is the tone that it is able to hit, where it is a guy just doing some of the most ridiculous stuff on screen to get a visceral reaction out of the audience. In the Crank movies, it's adrenaline. In this movie, it is not being able to feel pain and us feeling the just, oh my God, the visceral reaction of punching glass and using it essentially as like Wolverine claws, like that inability to feel the glass in your knuckles and then just punching a guy. Like, that is when this movie has a high. That is when this movie really works in some wonderful sequences. There is some really good action set pieces. The more and more extreme this movie goes, I actually think the more and more this movie works. There are some really specific moments in this movie that are just gnarly. They are disgusting. They just, it is everything that you want from a character that cannot feel pain. And this premise is not particularly smart in the sense of, like, this doesn't seem likely at all. Like, this guy is sticking his hands in like deep hot oil used for frying and like coming out and then like using it to burn somebody. Like, that is a premise that is in this movie, and you're either on board for it or you're not. Those scenes work well for me. There's a lot of action scenes in this movie where I just think it revolves around too much of Jack Quaid's character just kind of fighting guys, and not in a way where he's inflicting a ton of pain or using his inability to feel pain. Like, it's just at times him just throwing punches, and you don't get this feeling at all that this guy is well trained in combat. You don't think he'd be able to throw a punch. The only reason he can land punches is because, again, in some scenes he has like glass sticking out of his hands. Like, that is when the movie works very well. It's the fact of, like, there's just other scenes where he's going mano a mano with like a big guy, and like he's just kind of punching him until he can kind of get the drop on him by using like his inability to feel pain in the right circumstances. But like, him actually like fighting a bad guy, like him taking a punch, like, it's still the case of like a lot of this movie revolves around him like getting socked in the face really hard, and you're just like, he wouldn't wake up from that. Like, there is that kind of like disconnect. So it's almost like, I almost wish they had explored this character a little bit more to set up the idea that he himself has understood this about himself and he is almost trained for a circumstance like this, like almost like this weird John Wick character, or like he has this background. He doesn't. He's just quite literally a banker who's almost been a bubble boy his whole life. Like he hasn't been allowed to really experience anything. So the idea that he would be able to throw, even like be able to hang in a fight until he gets his basically power to not feel anything. Like the fact that he's hanging around that for even a few minutes just fundamentally doesn't make sense. And that is some of the issues with this movie. This movie could have gone more over the top. And I think this movie would have been better off had it gone a little crazier in this moment, or had given like a little bit more of an explanation to the craziness of it. Like I said, ultimately, this is supposed to be an everyday guy that doesn't feel pain. And in this movie, it just doesn't really make sense. And there is like a continuity issue that also happens, because although he can't experience pain, he can experience the things that come with pain. So for instance, like if he snaps his leg, his bone is still broken, so he's still walking weird. And that happens in scenes, but it doesn't happen enough to, again, really justify it, where it's just like, oh yeah, this guy wouldn't be able to like really be able to walk right now. Like they kind of like brush it off as adrenaline, but again, doesn't really make sense. So that's some of the fundamental issues, I think, of the storytelling in play, along with the fact that, as I already said, this movie is 1 hour and like 52 minutes, I think is what it clocks into. This movie should never be more than 95 minutes. I think this movie is just abysmally too long, and it really does start to drag out. The ending of this movie is really, really surprisingly long. It just kind of goes on. You're kind of getting beat after beat after beat. There's other elements of this movie. The Jack Quaid character has a love interest in this movie. This story doesn't really work, but they do something interesting to it that kind of subverts the expectations. They introduce this in the first or second act, and I think that actually gives the film a little bit of momentum and a little bit of surprise, because as the scene is transpiring in the beginning first act, I'm just like, I'm not really believing this, and this doesn't feel like the journey that this character would be going on. The Jack Quaid character, I mean. You'll see what I mean when you see this movie, but they do subvert that fairly smartly and do it early enough where you're like, oh, okay, that's an interesting wrinkle to this action adventure story that we're on. There are other elements of this movie that I enjoyed. You have the actor from the Spider-Man trilogy who plays Ned, Jacob Batalon, in this movie. He plays kind of a very similar role that he plays to Peter Parker, where he's the best friend who gets kind of like brought into this mission and just has to do a few really funny things and then like give some really good comedic dialogue as the kind of sidekick. Jacob's very talented at doing this. He is playing essentially the Ned character. The moments where he drops in for humor, I found most of his jokes to land pretty well. Like, he is a fun addition to this movie. And I do think that the chemistry between the Jack Quaid character and Amber Midthunder, who is the love interest in this movie, Sherry, I do think that works in this movie largely. Like, there is a lot of elements in this movie that I do think work enough for it to be cohesive, enough for it to be fun. Like, this is certainly not a bad movie. This was a movie that, again, and it's kind of the question of this thumbnail that I thought about while watching this movie, is this movie just isn't enough one way or the other. Either this movie needed to feel a little grittier and make the action a little bit more intense and kind of give a reason to everything going on and how this guy can fight and kind of be more in the lineage of John Wick or movies like that. Or this movie needed to be just flat out ridiculous, flat out crazy, go so over the top in moments and throughout. This movie has that in scenes and in brief moments, but it doesn't go crazy the entire movie. And I think going a little bit crazier, going a little bit more creative with the way that Jack Quaid's character fights really would have benefited this movie, because outside of it, there really is only 3 guys that Jack Quaid's character fights the entire movie. So I think, again, had there been maybe a bit more of a horde of an army out there, and then like he's going at it, and again, he has this kind of like just over the topness to this movie, I think it would have really benefited this movie and had a little bit more visceral feeling while watching it. At times, this movie feels visceral, and then at other times, it feels fairly cliched, a movie that you've seen before. Again, this is not a bad movie. I just don't think this is a particularly great movie, and it's not enough to really get through the finish line. I enjoyed this movie for what it was. I didn't think the action was all that great outside of the moments where this movie goes ridiculous. When this movie really commits to the silliness of its premise, I think that the action reflects that. And other times it does feel like the action is a little bit too embarrassed and they don't want to get as silly as they could have. And I think that's a disappointment. But overall, Novocaine, it's a good time in the theaters. I definitely would recommend this one enough. There's not really enough for me to be like, to be taken out of this movie, but it is certainly a movie that watching it, I definitely felt that it could have easily been better and that it was just missing that next gear to really make it a really good rewatch. This is a movie that I enjoyed. I don't think I would ever see myself watching this movie again. So that's where I stand with Novocaine. It is a solid 3 out of 5 star movie. Nothing more, nothing less. And this is a movie that you can see in theaters, but honestly, I think it would be totally fine if you waited to see this at home streaming. So thank you so much for watching this review. I will be having a few more reviews coming out soon, so make sure to subscribe to my channel for more.